Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. David Clews, broadcasting live from the Unity News Network studios up here in Glasgow, in the heart of the United Kingdom. And normally we do these streams on YouTube, but we are kind of slumming it tonight, unfortunately. We're joined by Catherine Blaiklock, and Catherine is with us. Catherine was the founder of the Brexit Party. So, Catherine, thank you very much for joining us. How are you tonight?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Great. If anyone's coming on Facebook, please do us a favour, hit the like button, hit the share button. If you're in any groups, this is an important conversation. We're going to discuss everything that's going on tonight. Obviously, it's been a big day. So, did you see this coming, Catherine? Boris proroguing Parliament?
Yes, I did, actually. I think the second he got Dominic Cummings in, that this is for real. A number of months ago, I think we knew that. I think he's been quite clever with giving out different messages. He's actually bypassing the press. He's live streaming and recording a lot of stuff himself. He refuses to do Channel 4, and I think he knows that he can be a Churchill or it will fail. He has to get this through. So yeah, I think this is predictable, and I'm quite optimistic about it, actually.
Yeah, I mean, we've been as a news organisation, you're allowed to have a bias as long as you admit it. I mean, we'll talk about that more in more detail later on. The big problem with the mainstream media is they pretend to be impartial when they're actually fighting in a vicious agenda. So, Catherine, take us back to the Brexit Party, because obviously the impact they've had has been huge, but with a lot that's going on, they've really grown. So you founded the Brexit Party, is that correct?
Correct. I mean, I bought a company before Nigel left UKIP early in December. It seemed to me that UKIP was failing. It wasn't concentrating on Brexit. It wasn't part of the Leave Means Leave organisation. Since the Henry Bolton days and the fiasco of that about another party, and I knew Nigel, and he then said he would come on board with me. And
it was all pretty good to start, and then I'm just going to go back, and you am I correct in saying you had to resign as leader of the Brexit Party, or you resigned for Nigel, is that correct? Just a slight issue there, ladies and gentlemen. I think with Catherine's connection, one of the perils of live streaming. If there's any issues, what we can do is we can just get Catherine on the phone if there's any more problems. So what we'll do is we'll just wait a couple more minutes. I'm keeping an eye out if Catherine comes back on. If there's any issues, what we'll do is we'll get her back on again. Everything we do live, and it's never easy. They say you should never work live, but obviously today it's been a very, very interesting day with what's happened with the proroguing of Parliament, of course. And we'll just keep an eye out, and hopefully Catherine will come back and join us. The numbers are going up, so we're just waiting on Catherine joining us again. I think there's been a slight issue in terms of the connection. So what I might actually do, ladies and gentlemen, is if Catherine doesn't appear again, we will get her on the phone and I will get her picture up and we'll carry on with the interview that way. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put the audio off for a couple of minutes, and we'll call Catherine and we'll get Catherine back on. So please stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back shortly. We are back with Catherine Blaiklock. I'm just going to get your picture up, Catherine. So, some slight technical issues. One of the perils of doing live interviews, but one of the reasons we do it live is that nobody can turn around and say that we cut and edited it to make you look bad. So, Catherine, talk back to us what happened. I think The Guardian did a bit of an expose about some comments you made. Do you want to maybe...
There's lots of issues relating to this. I mean, one of the things that's happened very recently is the Brexit Party are saying that they forced me to resign. Well, I mean, we cut clear about something. If I am the leader of the party with one other member and I own all the shares, they can't force me. As I said in my Telegraph interview, it's for me to give, not them to take. So this is sort of some nice history being rediscovered. You can't force somebody who's, if you own a house, you can't say, well, I'm going to force the person who owns the house out. You couldn't. But I offered my resignation to give Nigel the chance to be successful at that point. In terms of the comments, I mean, the first expose they did was a blog that I had written about my own black husband and testosterone and illegitimate children in Jamaica, and that got translated that, Nigel's mate thinks that black men are violent, and that testosterone causes that. That was the first thing, and then they uncovered some tweets. Again, 4,000 tweets. They uncovered, I think, 10 tweets that were problematic.
Mm-hmm.
As always, one of the most problematic, according to The Guardian, was a tweet where I said Mornington Crescent looks like Turkey. Well, I think it does, and I still think it does. And I think that there's a freedom of speech issue here. This is what's happening to everybody all the time. People, comments are taken out of context, and then you're hounded for saying things. So, I made 2 comments I think I made 2 or 3 comments only on Islam out of 4,000 tweets, and they've been blown up that, I'm an Islamophobe, etc. And I refuse to back down on those comments. I will say that I still think that those comments were reasonable, and because basically you can't say anything.
I don't disagree with you necessarily on that, but my question would be, was it not the way in which the Brexit Party kind of buckled on those issues that's left a bad taste?
I mean, they won't talk about anything. I mean, they won't talk about immigration, they won't talk about race, they won't talk about crime, they won't talk... they basically haven't got any policy. The party that I formed was a libertarian small government party that wasn't discriminatory but was anti-mass immigration. But now they don't talk about it. They've basically formed a left-right coalition, and the result of that left-right coalition is that they can't make policy. They can't make policy on anything. I'm going to give you 2 examples of this problem. Let's take, something that really shouldn't be related to the Brexit Party, but let's take homosexuality, okay? You have Anne Widdecombe in the party, who is a devout Christian who believes that homosexuality is a sin. That's her view. I think it's a valid view. It's not my view, but... and then you've got people who are... extreme left wing who, basically think that homosexuality is absolutely right in every respect, and that people who say it's wrong shouldn't be allowed to say that. If you take things like the economic policy, you take the minimum wage, you have people like Lance Foreman, for example.
We've had Lance on the show before.
Yes. And but his views are sort of similar to the IEA, Institute of Economic Affairs, extremely laissez-faire right-wing policies. He would like to have no minimum wage at all, the IEA sort of view. The minimum wage should be set by the market. And on the other hand, you have people like Claire Fox, who come from Marxism, who think the minimum wage should be doubled. So how do you form an economic policy like with that sort of set of viewpoints? You can't. And some of the economists for Brexit were asked to do economic policy for the Brexit Party and basically said the parameters were so ridiculous that they couldn't form this policy. So, that there have been a number of issues. But, I mean, they will say that they will defend free speech, but they won't. And anybody who said anything at all, even about immigration, I mean, they had the by-election in Peterborough. They never mentioned the elephant in the room. There were questions about 50 languages in schools, about the transformation of the city, etc. And they never answered a single question about it.
Is it not the case, though, and I'm going to argue the opposite of it, that they are merely playing the media, and they are what Nigel Farage is saying right now is that Brexit is the most important thing. We cannot talk about other topics until we deliver Brexit.
Yeah, I accept that to some extent. But the problem is right now that they're not even doing a particularly good job on Brexit. I mean, the issue is that UKIP won't talk to Nigel Farage. That was one of the reasons for this split was because of the Gerard-Nigel split that had gone back 25 years. If you took Peterborough, then the Conservative Party lost the seat, the Brexit Party lost the seat, Labour won the seat with a Remainer. And even if you'd added, for example, the SDP, which was Patrick O'Flynn, who is a former UKIP MEP, and you added the UKIP vote, well, though it was only small, if you'd added those fringe Brexit parties, then the Brexiteers would have won Peterborough. In Brecon, it was even worse, much, much worse, that they deliberately stood a candidate knowing that they had no chance to win. They got 10%, and it was a spoiler 10%.
Yeah, it stopped the Tories from winning. I was quite annoyed about it, if I'm being honest, Catherine, because it was totally unnecessary. Now, obviously, with the Brexit Party, they had this meteoric rise, and their social media was bang on. Their rallies were great, but I voiced that anything that goes big so quickly can go small equally as quickly.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Incredible political volatility. And the point is that Boris is the only person now in power who can deliver Brexit. He's the only person who has any power. I mean, it doesn't matter how many MEPs you've got, they have no power. So this lack of cooperation and the fact that the Brexit Party is saying that they're going to stand in all 650 seats. I've been very critical, as have a number of people who have tried to bash heads together. I mean, you're going to stand against Steve Baker, you're going to stand against Priti Patel, you're going to stand about Graham Stringer from the Labour Party, all the really, strong Brexiteers. It's a terrible policy. It's not helping. It's not helping at all.
100 viewers already on Facebook, which is brilliant. If you are coming on, please give this a like, give this a share. If you're watching on catch up on YouTube, sorry we weren't able to stream directly to YouTube. There's a slight issue, so we're just broadcasting on Facebook. Catherine, what was your intention for the Brexit Party when you founded it? What did you see it as doing?
Well, I thought that we were at that point. Of course, we had May, and it has had an extraordinarily important role of getting rid of May.
Yep.
But the other thing that I thought we were going to have was we were going to have Nigel of old and not Nigel of new. And Nigel of old was a very strong anti-immigration politician, I felt that he had the popularity that UKIP didn't have, and he had the name recognition worldwide, and he had the international connections, that he could have just stayed doing what he'd done in 2015, and he would have done very, very well. But instead, he, and again, I was helped to form this left-right coalition, which is fine for winning European elections, but it's the initial stuff was literally for the European elections and to put pressure on May, and that it was very successful in doing. So it has definitely achieved an important role that UKIP, by that point, for all sorts of reasons, the split with Anne-Marie Waters, the Henry Bolton issue, the fact that Nigel wasn't there, etc., that Gerard was following this anti-Islamic policy at the expense of Brexit, and obviously these policies can be important, but they are, as you mentioned earlier, an order. You have to get Brexit before you can control borders, and then you have to control borders, and then anything about Islam is a subsect of mass immigration. It's not an individual thing, so the order was all wrong.
I mean, I think we, again, you look at UKIP, and UKIP, well, I still think that they're finished. I think their name and their brand will forever be associated with getting a referendum. And then, as you point out, during the big issue, which was Brexit, Gerard Batten went down a route, and I disagree with the route that Gerard Batten went down, because where in my opinion, and I don't know what you think on it, Catherine, is that, this labelling of, I don't know, of Islam entirely as completely incompatible with the West. I don't agree with that. What's your opinion?
Yeah, effectively, yes. I think lots of these things simply come under under policing.
Mm-hmm.
That's the gist. They come under policing. If you're a paedophile, you should be under policing. I don't care really what religion or sect or nationality you are. But the big issue, for me, was about 350,000 people still pouring into this country, and it's worse than that, because that's the net figure. So the actual figure is 650,000, and we're issuing sort of 800,000. These are biblical numbers. And it doesn't really matter. The dislocation, the social dislocation, the jobs, the roads, the schools, the NHS.
And I think as well,
they're really related to Islam. They're related to, it doesn't matter whether you're Polish, Armenian, Ethiopian or whatever. It's going to be the same issue.
I think as well, one of the major issues around that is that you can be anti-immigration without being anti-immigrant. The two are completely different. My argument about the continuing allowance of mass immigration is it's actually going to have an effect on social cohesion within the United Kingdom, and constantly bringing in people, pushing wages down. Eventually people are going to reach a point where they say, look, I'm here, all I can achieve is a minimum wage job, I'm never going to be able to buy a house, I'm in a crime-riddled area. It's not actually fair on the people coming into the country either.
Well, and it's not fair on the existing immigrants. There's lots of Jamaican, Barbadian, various other people. Who voted for Brexit. I know people from Barbados who's they're second generation. Their grandfather fought for the British, and they're called by new wave, say, Croatians, that they're not really British. And they say, but we're more British than you are. So yes, of course, all those things are correct. Lots of immigrants have been extremely unhappy about their destruction of their communities as well. It affects them. It affects everybody who's here already. But it's the sheer volume. It's a volume issue. Society simply can't cope with it.
So why is Nigel Farage scared to talk about this?
Because the press hound you, and because we are now in what we have is not, it's really just an issue of free speech. It's self-censorship all the time. You self-censor what you can say. If you say, you remember all the row that Boris has had about, burqas looking like letterboxes. It doesn't go away. You remember the poster that Nigel had, or you remember
of course.
Nigel's thing about saying he didn't want to live next to a pile of Romanian men. Do you remember that one?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God, they went on and on and on and on and on about it. That's like when he eventually said, well, I don't want to live near a pile of any men. But you just get hounded. And so all these politicians have become plastic, and that's what Nigel's done. And he's the thing about Nigel, he can probably get 10% without even having a party or a strategy. He'll get that himself. But he can make a big mess as well. And I think Brecon, he was a zero rather than a hero on it.
Do you think as well with Nigel Farage, he has got too used to the limelight? He's enjoying it a bit too much. And there's a lot of money involved here as well.
Well, and I think what he wanted to do with Richard Tice is he wanted to put pressure on the Conservatives to absolutely force them to give him some seats, some winnable seats, so that Nigel and Richard Tice and a few other people would end up in the House of Commons. That's what Nigel wanted to do. But unfortunately, what they did in Brecon made them so unpopular. I mean, one of the expressions I've had from people in the Conservative Party was that they were behaving like insurgents and gangsters. And if you're the smaller party, then you have to coalesce into the bigger party. I mean, it's like the Liberal Democrats winning Brecon and Plaid Cymru and the Green Party coalesced. You can't expect the Conservatives to drop their seat for you with your much smaller percentage. That was the problem. And again, I understand for the local constituency level, they were offered some sort of deal and they would refuse to take it. So as a result, the vote was split. And then they're carrying on with this 650. And I think Boris is just going to say, okay, well, I'm going to push it through. And if I push this through, you're finished. But my real concern is what happens after Brexit then, and where we end up with what Boris does. I mean, I like Boris, but I have to say as well, I mean, despite the things I've said tonight, I like Nigel. I think he's a charismatic person. I think he's done an enormous amount for changing the political agenda. It's just a shame that what he does here now is not the same as he even says. He'll go and give a speech in South Carolina and say something much more like the old Nigel.
Yeah, it's quite surreal, really, when people like you and I who watch politics all the time, and a lot of our audience aren't stupid. They see it as well.
It's plastic. It's plastic. It's a firework party.
My argument with what the Brexit Party has done is they've actually closed the Overton window even more shut about what's acceptable conversation in public discourse. Now, I don't think what you and I are talking about is unacceptable. I think we're having an adult conversation about difficult issues. But if we can't discuss these difficult issues, is it not just going to actually drive people into the hands of even more radical elements?
We're going to have a void again. Well, if Boris gets tough on immigration, I mean,
Priti Patel says Priti Patel's starting to talk really tough. I've been very impressed.
So she is definitely a law and order right-wing person, and I think on some of the other things, HS2 and foreign aid and NHS and all sorts of other things, I think that Boris will probably do a decent job. But I mean, to come along and say we are going to give amnesty to illegal immigrants, I mean, it's just like a red flag to a bull. I mean, my first husband is Nepalese. People would just arrive on tourist visas and become illegal immigrants. It's just, instead of having 1 million potential, we think we've got about 1 million from Home Office numbers illegals. We could have 5, 10. We don't know how many we've got anyway now. So, this is still the hot potato that people will not talk about.
Catherine, you're obviously a very bright person and you're a very forthright person. Do you think people are a wee bit scared of the clarity in which you talk about these issues?
Yes, but the point is the personal cost to the people who talk about them, like myself, is very great, because you get called everything. You know, I've got a black husband, I've got 2 half Asian children, and I'm called a racist. You know, and the irony is that I actually suffer racism at times. I have to defend my husband against people who are being deliberately nasty because he's black, and then I'm at the same time called a racist because I'm an anti-immigration campaigner. But we've got to talk about it. The world is changing. Their world has changed, and we aren't going to put that genie back in the bottle. You can see that change going through the world with Trump, and in Brazil, and even in India, and of course in Europe, in France and Italy with Salvini, Austria, etc. So this world is not going to go back away. Populism is here to stay, and one of the things that's causing this problem is our culture. I mean, it is our culture. You know, you come to Rome, do as the Romans do.
But how do you respond when someone says that you are racist or Islamophobic because you hold those views? How do you counteract against that?
Well, I'm getting to the point I don't care about it, okay? It's just like, fine, call me racist. Call me. That's what Batten said. Call me a racist. I'll wear it as a mark, because we've actually now moved even on from racism. That isn't strong. We're now white supremacists. Yeah. I will carry on. I mean, what I've said about Islam is not that everybody is evil or whatever, but, you know, I think there's certain things in our culture that didn't used to exist 45 years ago, and they are not our culture. It's very simple. We've got a list of them, you know. Acid attacks. When was the first acid attack? I grew up in the 1960s, 70s, never heard of them, yeah? Didn't know what FGM was. Arranged marriages, honour attacks, you know, the list goes on and on of things that are not part of our culture. So, you know, it worries me losing our culture. Our culture is very strong, and it has been strong. You know, it's millennia. And similarly, when I send people, I run a healthcare charity, when I send people to Nepal, I expect people to respect Nepal's culture. I don't expect them to bathe half naked in streams and cause a riot.
Well, of course, the Dalai Lama has spoken on this issue.
Yeah.
And he was also called a racist as well, wasn't he?
It's hilarious. I mean, if you're Palestinian, you're allowed to have a homeland. If you're Tibetan and you're under occupation from China, this is a major problem. But if you're you know, if you're British, you're not allowed to have a homeland. I mean, particularly, this is the funny thing about England. I mean, we've got even less than anybody else. At least you've got some little teeny bit of Scottish Parliament, but, you know, yeah, it's dreadful.
But what the left would say is that discussing these issues are similar to those held by extremists, you know, but it's just you say it in a more watered down way.
We're getting to the point where 65% of 70% of the population think that mass immigration is a big problem. Mm-hmm. That ghettos and integration are a big problem. And the other thing to think about is that, you know, we are forming ghettos within ghettos.
Yep.
We don't even understand the nuances. I mean, I can just give you an example from Nepal, which is one tiny country, but it's got 70 different languages, and it's got its own class system, and different languages don't talk to each other. You know, so you haven't just imported sort of 500 languages. You've imported like thousands of microsects. You know, that a Nepalese Buddhist doesn't really integrate with a Nepalese Hindu. That Nepalese Hindu doesn't really integrate with a Nepalese, with an Indian. With the Brahmins don't really integrate with the untouchables. So you bring the host country's divisions and you dump all of those in as well. And what you do is you create chaos eventually. And what happens when you eventually create chaos is that you have a very, very high probability of violence. And is to stop violence. I mean, if you've lived in countries, and I have, I was in India when Mrs. Gandhi was killed, and a Sikh was killed in my bathroom, and he was only killed because he was a Sikh and because Mrs. Gandhi had been murdered by a Sikh. That is sectarian violence, racial sectarian violence,
which we do not obviously want to come to the United Kingdom under any circumstances. We actually had an incident up in Glasgow where a member of the Ahmadiyya, I've interviewed someone from the Ahmadiyya community and the Muslim community, was murdered by an extremist. He actually drove up from Bradford and stabbed him.
Yes. Yeah.
But here is the thing. You know, the Brexit Party with all the shiny rallies, you know, Richard Tice up on the stage, Nigel Farage up there, all looking great. You know, I would imagine they would run away if you started talking about these issues.
Well, they're going to fail. There is no political gap if Boris gets through Brexit for just a plastic party that talks about Brexit and democracy, because those two things will have been achieved, and therefore then that's not where the gap is. So they'll be finished. It's as simple as that. And then the question is really whether we go back to two-party politics and whether we just have sort of some amalgam of the left, which becomes more extreme, and we have some amalgam of the right, which is under the Conservatives, or whether what happens in the Conservative Party. I mean, this is the crux, whether we are going to deal with the 200 Conservative MPs who are not only just Remainers, but are effectively Liberal Democrats. They are open borders, they're sort of mushy globalists.
I mean, I think what you're alluding to is the rise of a populist party akin to Trumpism in America. And what is interesting about Trumpism is it appeals greatly to blue-collar Democrats. So how does populism, how do you get it to appeal to working class communities? Because it tends to be working class communities that do have more of the concerns around uncontrolled immigration, lack of integration and law and order. So how does this populist movement reach them?
It's very simple. I mean, the fundamental problem in this country is we talked briefly about economics, but the fundamental problem is the culture wars, is this social split. And you have to realise that many working class communities are fundamentally socially conservative. And they are also aspiring. They don't want to carry on being this. This is, of course, what Thatcher tapped into. They aren't where the left is socially. They're not very comfortable with transgender lessons. They're not, you know, they actually want their children to do rather well. They want law and order to be reinforced.
I mean, I personally, you know, I've been a member of the Labour Party and I have a strong social conscience, but the modern Labour Party that has embraced identity politics, much the same way the Democrat Party in America has embraced identity politics, it makes them almost unelectable or unvotable.
Yeah, and then there are lots of other policies, such as, you know, the climate change policies. You know, and it doesn't really matter what your view on climate change is. The issue is how do you what sort of emphasis stuff, and you're going to destroy people's housing because they can't afford electricity or you know, fuel. You destroy your transportation, as you see in France, which is where those riots started. You know, people are living for this week about filling up their petrol, not for some theory that might or might not happen. Again, you know, we had the hottest summer for 50 years. Well, what happened 50 years ago? You know, we're supposed to be getting hotter, but it's the response to this stuff. And they're just saying, like, I'm not voting for climate change and transgender bathrooms. This isn't where I am at all. I'm voting so that I can walk down the street and my rubbish gets picked up. And of course, then on the economic front, there was this issue about globalization and Amazon. and those are things that I don't think that lots of people are addressing, about how to deal with a globalized economy and a globalized world.
Is it not also the issue that one of the big problems is politics is so shaped by the London metropolitan bubble, and once you leave London, the UK, especially parts of England, it's just a completely different world?
Well, they're much more conservative, socially conservative than this liberal bubble.
Mm-hmm.
They're just not speaking this sort of language. We have this disconnect between what BBC and Channel 4 are doing in the London bubble and what people are saying on social media and what people are saying at the end of comments on probably programmes like this.
But how long now, and again, this is the thing I will say in favour of Nigel Farage and Richard Tice, was their strategy to assiduously court the mainstream media worked. They became the acceptable opposition, and they did a great job of that.
They did, and they're very good at that. The fundamental problem comes now. That was a European election strategy. Now you're in a different period, and I mean, if you go to the rallies, they're the same rally.
Yeah.
They're the same thing.
Yep.
And they're sort of fireworks and
it's all a bit.
And
it's. I mean, I remember when it all appeared, people were raw. We never left on the 29th of March,
yeah.
and there was almost something slightly messianic about it, almost. And Nigel was.
Well, we
really,
had May as well. I mean, that was really important. Every single day she opened her mouth with some other ridiculous policy. I mean, we got from the gender pay gap, now we had the diversity pay gap. And we had, tie ourselves down on some more green deals or this, that and the other. So she was just like it was Liberal Democrat spiel as well as the Brexit stuff.
And so what do you think will happen? Do you think Boris will get a deal, or we will leave WTO on the 31st of October?
I don't know which of the two, but he's going to get us out.
Yep.
I mean, the point is he has to. He knows, and Boris has got big ambitions. Yep. Boris's hero is Churchill. He wants to be the saviour of the country. He wants to carry on and become the greatest prime minister for this decade. And he's not going to do that if he gets chucked out in 2 months.
No.
So he knows that he's got to push this through. Otherwise, the Conservative Party's finished. He's finished. So he's going to get it through.
Yep.
He will, in my opinion, get something through.
I agree. And my other analysis I've used, again, I've been a Tory party member as well. I'm a political nomad. The one thing about the Tory party is they know about survival. And they know, they see themselves as Britain. And if you speak to big business and you speak to senior people, they might not want a no deal, but they would rather have a no deal Brexit than a Jeremy Corbyn government, and that's what's on offer.
Yeah.
And the Tories know that if they don't deliver, they'll be out. And
I think actually that maybe the threat at the moment is actually the Liberal Democrats, because I think Corbyn's star has fallen so dramatically too. I mean, I don't know that he's going to survive that long. I could see we have a new person in there, maybe, Thornbury or McDonnell or somebody who could be worse.
Yeah, I think the Labour Party in their current incarnation are going to be finished because, Jeremy Corbyn was elected as a Marxist left-wing candidate. And I mean, fair enough. But if you're a Marxist or a left-winger, you have to be opposed to the European Union. Jeremy Corbyn is a lifelong Eurosceptic from the Bennite wing of the Labour Party.
I know, and I mean, I quite like that part of him.
Yeah,
and so Tony Blair as well. I mean, they understood the dangers of it.
Well, that's right, and so was John McDonnell. And I think John McDonnell sharing a stage with all of these Remainers who, they're not left wingers. I think they've made a real tactical error there. So, I think as well, as you say, even if it's a deal and it's not May's deal, but is there not the risk though that, Farage has said if it's not a WTO Brexit, I will stand. Is there not a risk that, the Brexit Party get grounded in that ideological purity and not just accept, look, we're out?
I mean, they're not polling. I think Boris has taken their thunder, so they're not polling very well at the moment. So, you know, they had an important purpose.
Yeah, they did.
Very important, as was UKIP. I think they are finished. That's my honest opinion, because I think Boris will deliver, and he will deliver more strongly on crime and punishment and all sorts of other issues. But the real problem, as we said, is what is he going to do about mass migration and illegal immigrants? And if no party's there, we're going to be back where we are. But
if Boris does deliver on that, I mean, you're talking about potentially winning 46% of the vote, or, you know.
Yes. Well, I think that we could do with a strong government that can actually get stuff done and does some stuff. So I'm relatively optimistic. I think we're in a better place than we were.
And what do you think Nigel Farage's career will be moving forward? Do you think he'll just go to the media side of things?
Nigel would like to go to America, I think. Nigel would like to go to the House of Lords. Nigel would ideally, I think, like to get a parliamentary seat. I think that's looking less and less likely, but who knows what they will do behind the scenes, whether they will do some deal with him. I mean, he deserves it. He does deserve it. I despite the fact that I'm not in that party, I still think he's a great politician, a politician of our century.
I mean, I think you can be critical of your friends. You know, one of the problems with modern politics, and I really hate, is that if you're on someone's side, you have to just be a nodding dog all the time. You know, I think we should be allowed to, and I think that puts people off politics, that, you know, if you're on a certain team, surely we should be allowed to critique people without taking it personally.
Yeah, I agree. And that's the problem at the moment, is that people won't accept any criticism whatsoever. I mean, you know, UKIP's been as bad on that. I mean, Gerard Batten would not accept any criticism whatsoever. You know, he caused terrible splits, because effectively he became what Anne-Marie Waters had already split. Anne-Marie Waters had gone off to be an anti-Islamic party, and then UKIP at that time became another one with identical policies.
But from what you're saying is that you believe that the gap on the market is more to do with anti and controlling immigration. That's where you see the gap on the market. Yeah,
and controlling, you know, the repercussions of illegal immigration. And we have now, I mean, my issue is that we've got 10 million people with 2 passports. It's like, which country are you playing cricket for? We've had numerous examples of this recently. I mean, an example was when a nightclub, when that Romanian bouncer was murdered by somebody outside a Mayfair nightclub last New Year. Within a few days, that person was in Jordan on their other passport. My ex-husband changes his passport on the plane. You know, I'm Nepalese for one function and I'm British for another function. But the only people who don't have, 10 million people can change passports. If we had a war, we have national service, we have an economic downturn, we have a change in all sorts of things, they don't need to be here. They can just waltz off somewhere else. So the mugs, like the rest of us, are here. We haven't got anywhere else to go. We don't have another homeland.
So what is your future? What are you going to do? Because you've obviously got a willingness.
I'm starting a free speech campaign called the Magna Carta campaign, and this is to fight for people who have lost their jobs for something they've said. And I mean, last year we had 95,000 arrests for hate speech. 95,000. These are some of the categories. Transgender, for example, about 45%. A lot of people who get arrested, they don't necessarily all go to court, but it can really affect people's lives, their children. It can affect their jobs. We've had numerous examples. And we had Noah Carl, who lost his job for some research. I mean, effectively, I lost my job. We had a man from Asda who lost his job or he's in review at the moment, for posting a Billy Connolly.
I saw that about Billy Connolly joke, yeah.
Yeah. but there's dozens and dozens and dozens of them. There have been a lot on Christians. We've been documenting them, and what we want to do is we want to have a launch, and we want to document these people, carry on documenting, and then take some test cases. There have been 1 or 2 test cases recently. There was the case that was won, although it was a very partial win, with, I've forgotten which university, but it was one of the universities where this was a Christian again who said that, you know, he thought that homosexuality was immoral, and he was chucked off the course. That, you know, they have partial wins, but we're not anywhere near changing the law, and people are frightened to say
okay,
things.
I'm gonna turn this back on you. Will you defend Labour Party members accused of anti-Semitism?
Well, you know, it's about your right to say things. People cannot agree with it. It's whether you're allowed to say it.
But the reason I'm asking that is because I think what's happened there.
I mean, I actually think that you know, I think that the limit to free speech should be when I say I'm going to rape you XYZ. You know, I'm going to come and kill you, David Clews, right? You specifically, you. You know, that becomes that's a personal vendetta or personal threat.
But a lot of organisations would argue that, you know, dehumanising communities, speaking ill of certain communities, legitimises violence against them. So, you know, are you enabling that? You know, that's what they would argue.
But I'd argue the complete opposite. If you don't allow people to speak, then you fester wounds, and then they eventually explode. The US has been much more clear on it. The Supreme Court has basically, you know, said that you can be a Holocaust denier. I mean, the rest of us think you're nuts in the same way as we think that you believe in UFOs is nuts. But that you can say it. But is there not?
One of the big issues we've got is on social media now. And the censorship that takes place on social media. Yeah. You know, there's been a lot of deplatformings here, a lot of deplatformings. Do you think that's going to continue?
I think we've got a big problem. I mean, because these are private companies run out of the States. And the only way we're going to get that solved is if Trump solves it. I mean, if legislation goes in the US, because we're under that control. And obviously, it will be better for us when we're out of the European Union. At least we won't be as censored from that specific source. But over in Twitter and Facebook, I think we're going to still have tremendous difficulties. I think we may see new platforms form, but you know, these companies are massive and have monopolies.
It's extremely difficult because the masses use these platforms. And how? I mean, do you get on the mainstream media anymore? Do you do much on mainstream media?
Well, I was in the Telegraph last week. I did Brexit Chopper's podcast. I tend to, when I get on things, they tend to take things and then pick up one point that I've made, and you know, like they made from this. That's when they, you know, it's a character assassination. That's what most people on the right just get assassinated.
And do you believe that is because there's an inherent liberal left bias in the mainstream media in the UK?
Yeah, without any doubt, and that's led by the BBC and the universities, and that media is out of touch, as you were talking about, with ordinary people. You know, it's not polite to say somebody's very fat, yeah. Or it's not polite to say that I don't like women in headscarves necessarily. It's not very polite. But, you know, polite. If you lose free speech, you become the Stasi. Totalitarian state.
But what I'm arguing to the converse of that is that I think this isn't just necessarily a left-right thing. I think it's a centrist issue that, you know, centrist Remainers, metropolitan types. And that's where I do have a sympathy with some of Jeremy Corbyn's stuff. You might not like what he says, but Jeremy Corbyn has a right to say it. As
does Anne Widdecombe.
Anne Widdecombe.
As do the Muslims who are standing outside Birmingham schools.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a really interesting one, and we've spoken about that because a lot of people on the Brexit side, our side, in social media, they actually support a lot of these parents.
Yeah,
and the left don't know what to do.
Well, they're going to blow themselves up. The left is finding, of course, this is the problem. The irony is that a lot of immigrants are far more socially conservative than the native population.
That's right.
That's not just in the Muslim community. That's
right.
in the Indian and the Nepalese. My husband's Jamaican. I mean, Jamaican is a virulently anti-homophobic country. It's a fundamentalist Old Testament Christian country. And there are lots and lots and lots of people who have social conservative values relating to family and sexuality, etc. And you're not allowed to say them. Christians particularly are having a very, very big problem.
And most of this does come from the media, doesn't it? I mean, we've had a hatchet job done on us from The Guardian and Channel 4, and they're the source of this, but then the BBC are the Hydra, aren't they? How do we, would Boris have the guts to take the BBC on? Because they need to go under no circumstances.
I don't think he does, but not at the moment. But he's got too many other fights. I mean, he's got to fight one thing at a time. He's got to get Brexit through, and he's got to consolidate his majority and consolidate his position before he can even attempt any of these other things.
I mean, the thing is as well, though, this what we are debating, and I actually always go back to this because UNN, what we're trying to do is give all sides. This actually takes place on the left as well, because Corbynism is seen as an insurgent movement, and they're not particularly liked that much by the Guardianistas, by the BBC either. So is it not getting back to a state where we can respect and have adult debates about things rather than being treated like children who aren't allowed to discuss certain topics?
I'm not sure. I really am not sure about this. I mean, social media certainly has got a major role to play in this. It becomes just ad hominem attacks on people rather than... we've really gone past the point where we can't debate stuff.
No, that's right. That's right. And it's frightening. But why are... because originally free speech, a lot of it in the 80s was from the left, because it was considered that... the Thatcher government was shutting down on free speech, and now it's turned 360. How can we get back to this away from this culture of fear? And as you say, people losing their jobs, people losing their livelihood, just for saying something. And again, the other issue, Catherine, is a lot of these people making these comments, without being nasty, they may not be as educated about these issues. They may not realise what they're saying isn't allowed, and they lose their job for it.
I mean, the issue with jobs is that this is not even the law. This is just some arbitrary company deciding that it doesn't like what somebody said or posted.
Well, because we do. I mean, it is a point. We have hate speech laws in this country that are designed to protect people. Now, there's some debate about whether we need those, but a lot of these individuals who are losing their jobs, they never get charged with hate speech.
Correct, they don't. And it's judge and jury. Well, in this, I mean, some of it falls under employment law, and some of it's going to fall under trying to get some test cases to establish case law on it. That they're going to pay very heavily if they do it. Mm-hmm. But there are a number of aspects to it, and the fundamental problem is, how do you define this stuff? Even under the hate speech law, you can't define it. It's very, very vague.
I think you rightly pointed out the culture wars are here now in the UK. They probably started about 5 years ago, maybe a bit more in America, and they are in the midst of it, and it's coming here as well. And the question is, is there ever a winner in these culture wars? Because it looks to me like America's just a war of attrition now, and the UK's probably going to be a war of attrition as well.
It's a very gloomy prognosis because these countries are divided approximately 50-50, and the extremes of the politics are moving on both sides away from each other.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the Brexit thing that exemplifies it, and it would be the same whichever issue you took. At some point, I hope that we'll have that Boris will produce a strong right-wing government that will establish some of these issues and really stamp a mark on it and change it, because it's been moving in one direction for the last 20 years. We have been moving left. We've been losing liberty. We've been losing what we've been allowed to say, and it's getting to the point where the line has got to be drawn, and we've got to push back on it.
So, Catherine, if people want to keep up to date with you, you write for The Telegraph. I think you've been on the BBC a few times on the radio. How can people keep up to date?
I've been on Radio Norfolk. I usually get some hatchet jobs done every so often in the Eastern Daily Press. I was in the Metro the other week, and I'm on Twitter. I am going to be launching this free speech thing probably later in the year towards October.
And Catherine, we've had you on the show. You can give us a plug. How important is new media like UNN in this country to provide an alternative to the mainstream media?
I think it's essential. I think this is what has changed the political dialogue. I mean, without the big YouTubers, I don't think we would have had some of this change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's essential.
And how can we get Nigel back to the Nigel of old, the fearless Farage? How do we get him back?
I think he's gone.
Right, okay.
He's been doing it a long time. I think he wants to play golf now.
Okay. Well, it's up to a new generation of people to come through, and you might be one of them, Catherine. Catherine, thanks very much for coming on the show. We'd love to have you on again sometime in the future.
Thanks, David. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Take care. I'll send you the link later on. Okay, Catherine?
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.